Up next, you've actually already met him. He pinch hit for a panelist that wasn't able to make it. We have Dan Sutton, the CEO of Tantalus Labs, coming up. Tantalus was founded in British Columbia to advance the frontier of sun-grown cannabis. Their team consists of scientists, designers, and engineers who cultivate world-class cannabis in a technical greenhouse. When I first started investing in this industry in 2016 and early 2017, a lot of people were saying you can't grow good dope in a greenhouse. There were battles on social media. Greenhouse is garbage. This isn't going to work. So in order to educate myself, I went online, and Google, I still think, is the smartest invention ever. I went online and Googled greenhouse cannabis, and I came upon a video. There was a damn TED Talk on sun-grown cannabis. And there's this young, handsome man, full of youth and vigor, and it was entertaining. I just wish our video gets 110,000 views like yours. Dan Sutton, get your ass up here.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, brother. Here you go.
Great. Green button, right?
Yep.
Cool. Guys, this is going to be a lot of fun. So when I first started pitching Tantalus Labs as a greenhouse cannabis cultivation environment, I'm preaching to the converted here because you guys live and breathe greenhouse agriculture, and the first principles logic around cultivating a plant in sunlight seems like second nature at this point in the conversation. But we just, I don't know, somehow fallen into this weird era in cannabis where it was true, maybe it is still true, that the best cannabis on earth was coming out of indoor environments, and a lot of cultivars have been bred specifically for those environments. So greenhouse cannabis was a bit of a tough rock to push off the hill and start rolling, but thanks to the hard work of people like Afria, who are also very early in that conversation, and our team at Tantalus Labs, we brought investors and we brought, at the end of the day, end consumers back to the notion that, look, natural production principles that allow you to maximize your plant's health really need sunlight as a core baseline of that input. So I'm really excited about this story that I get to tell you guys today. We're kind of a little, do we get, there we go. So also I'm an active social media person. I'm sort of an elder millennial. I'm like 32, so I'm just old enough to have been using Facebook in college. And Twitter is now my new favorite medium. If any of you guys follow me on Twitter, you'll know that there's always fireworks on any given Tuesday. And check out Tantalus Labs too. We've got kind of a new social media strategy around recreational cannabis, and there is some pretty interesting content that comes through that. Also, the imagery that I've used for this presentation was all shot at our facility, all shot by us. It's all never been seen before, so these are all exclusive photos. I've actually tried to move the text around so that we can really highlight the photography of the cannabis and focus on what we're doing and what we're trying to do to differentiate on quality. So, quads. Does anyone know the word quads? Quads is hey, Dieter knows the word quads. Quads is a colloquial slang from the black market that refers to cannabis that would be rated above AAA. Quadruple A, it usually refers to exceptional genetics that have been very meticulously cared for. And it's really, I think, for a premium or boutique cannabis offering, we need to use that black market standard, especially in British Columbia, where some of the finest black market cannabis in the world is cultivated today, to establish the principles of what those discerning users that are currently using cannabis today expect when they buy a 15 or even higher dollar strain. So these are some metrics that we use at Tantalus Labs to describe what we aspire to in terms of quadruple A cannabis. Really important that you quantify with validated lab tests. There are a lot of stories out there about 30%, 33% cannabis. It does exist. It's just incredibly rare, and most of the time that you're hearing about those super high percentages, perhaps above the mid-20s, it's either been manipulated in its lab testing or the lab has been perhaps less than effective. We're lucky in the ACMPR that everyone has to play by the same lab standards, and so we can now quantify this with some effectiveness. We really like moisture content in our buds. It creates unique QA challenges because you need to store it in humidity-controlled and environmentally controlled environments. Actually, my good friend Ryan Lee gave me my favorite adjective to describe the ideal feel of a cannabis bud in its best moisture range, and that's nerfy, like a Nerf football. Aggregate terpene profile is probably the closest thing we have to a quantification of very flavorful or exceptionally flavorful cannabis. The terpenes work with other compounds in the plant to give the cannabis its flavor range, its odor, and so we really like to look at whatever the dominant terpene is and the lower order terpenes, bring those above an aggregate of 2%. It is true that quadruple A cannabis today likely is high THC cannabis. There's excellent cannabis that has, mixed balances of cannabinoids, both THC and CBD, lower order cannabinoids. We're going to be learning more about that as the market unfolds. And also high CBD cannabis that, I believe is excellent. Botanically, it's beautiful. It smells really great. But it seems as though the highest premiums in the market still are focused around those high THC strains. And now botanically, we can talk about, if you look at this particular plant, you can see a formation of these glands, these little, they look like little mushrooms until you dry them, and then they sort of look like little crystals. And the density of those glands that are called trichomes, that's really indicative of the plant's health, how well the genetics have been optimized, and how well those glands have been able to thrive. I think there's nobody who looks at a large cannabis bud and doesn't see quality. It's harder to grow larger cannabis buds, and we actually stratify our harvests into A grade buds, B grade buds. There's people that are just selling top colas in the ACMPR, and that large bud structure is really it's like a prized fruit. It's if you have a top cola in your hand, that's the plant's only producing one of them, and so that's a really exciting cannabis experience for the discerning user base. Strong and differentiated flavor profile. Cannabis is crazy in its flavor differentiation. I mean, you get coffee aficionados that are noticing these tiny nuances between the differences of a Sumatran or Ethiopian bean. There's cannabis that smells like a freshly opened Sharpie marker. And there's cannabis that smells like a pineapple. I mean, it's so broad in its ranges, and you can tailor your experience based on how you react in your olfactory bulb and in your own perception. And so that strong flavor profile, I remember a company that will not be named came out with stealth mode cannabis that doesn't smell. And the average cannabis consumer was just like, what are you talking about? You clearly have never had a conversation with a cannabis user. Nobody wants cannabis that doesn't smell, at least at this upper range of the discerning flavor profile. Interesting coloration and unique character. I don't think this gets enough story. The first time any one of us ever saw purple cannabis, we probably considered it quite exceptional. And that's a great story to tell about botany, bringing it back to these unique characterizations of the plants. And this last one is, I only just realized this is contentious, but it is true that when you consume the cannabis by smoking it in a joint, you want to have the smooth flavor, a lack of harshness or a lack of acrid smoke, a flavorful, tangible in your palate. And then I've always considered a burn of white ash to imply a very clean, well-dried, well-flushed cannabis plant. But apparently, based on a really interesting debate I saw between Ryan and our good friend John Page from Anandia Labs, white ash doesn't necessarily mean that the cannabis has been effectively flushed of its nutrients or not. But all I know is that all the cannabis in our range at Tantalus Labs does burn with white ash, and it also seems to taste pretty good. So maybe that's one you can debate with your friends. So there are a lot of ways to pursue quality cannabis. And I think there's 1,000 ways to skin a cat when it comes to growing good weed. I mean, that's really what I've learned over my 6-year journey in this industry is nobody has this figured out to a place where it's 5 times better than any other cultivation method. So every time I talk about what quality cannabis means to us as a company or to me, I'm really talking about just the Tantalus Labs perspective, and not everyone buys into this or not everyone agrees. The cannabis does speak for itself in a really interesting way. But this is just kind of how we think through our quality differentiation and how we run our process. So every cultivar, every varietal that Tantalus offers is a phenotyping run we've done ourselves. We don't buy clones. We have a seed bank, and we will take select cultivars, run them through a phenotyping process where you run perhaps 100 or 200 seeds. I'll come back to that actually. And we would only select, plants that we perceive to be in the top sort of 5% of that run, whether it be from agricultural robustness as a perspective, fast growing, and ideally some interesting characteristics that make that plant unique, make it a cool story that our excellent brand team can then go out and articulate to our end user. We talked a bit about operations panel, a panel that I snuck in on. I was like full wedding crashers on that thing, but thanks a lot for listening to me anyway. And the repeatability of our process is really important. Now, that doesn't mean the rigidity of our process. Our process is flexible. We have various fertigation forks, for instance, where we're feeding different cultivars, different nutrient profiles. But we need to know that we can get to the same outcomes every time when it comes to establishing a baseline of quality. And that's, as Dieter mentioned earlier, it's really measure, analyze, and then iterate. The same principles that you'd see in a great tech company, you have to be able to know what kind of iterations are going to potentially threaten the baseline of quality that you've established for a particular variety, and then what can actually optimize that more effectively. And even in the most ironclad processes in the ACMPR, there is no replacement for grower intuition. I'm really lucky to work with some of the most talented growers that I've ever met in British Columbia, and that intuition plays a role on a daily basis. I think the goal of repeatability is to take the decision-making away from the mundane and repeatable so that the decision-making energy can be really focused on the highest ROI impacts on your potential cultivation run. Harvesting and perfect ripeness. I've talked to growers that say that this is a matter of hours. I think it definitely is a matter of just a few days, and it takes, once again, some quantifiable metrics and some grower intuition to be able to say this plant at its flowering stage. I think it's in any cannabis cultivation operation, whether it's illegal or legal, there's an incentive to rush it. There's an incentive to do it too early, and you really have to let that bud and that plant come to its perfect ripeness before you then harvest it. And then finishing. This is something that I think there's a huge operational incentive to rush as well. Meticulous process in everything from drying, harvesting, drying, processing, whether that be trimming by hand, trimming by machine, and then storage. All of that plays such a critical role in the preservation of that bud's character. When it's in its late stages of flowering, the plant is perfect. You have a perfect manifestation of its genetic. And the process through which you finish it is the lens through which you see that perfection. You can see it through a polished lens, or you can see it through a dirty lens. And your finishing process is really going to be the differentiation there. We believe that you have to trim it dry to be able to get the best quality cannabis. When you trim wet, you release chlorophyll from the wet leaves, and that chlorophyll, when it dries, it imparts a smell. Some people call it grassy, some people call it kind of like hay. I know not everybody agrees with that, but that's just kind of where we're at, that we believe we need to be able to trim that product dry to get the best out of it. And then, as I mentioned, the controlled storage and packaging. And the whole process has to be thoroughly datafied. I think we're measuring 30 environmental parameters in our greenhouse at any given time. Every part of our process is quantified, every part of, almost to the timing. We're taking timestamps on how long it takes everybody to do everything. And so understanding, I think in our first 6 harvests or so, we had some pretty massive iteration gaps. Now it's a bit more knob twisting, at least on the cultivars that we're growing. And so you have to be thirsty to get better every time. It has to be that samurai discipline of continuous aspiration to just unreachable mastery. Otherwise, other people are going to catch up with you. That's part of how to stay on the top of a premium quality offering. So we talked about phenotypic selection at the beginning of the last slide. The pheno hunt is sort of the colloquialism here. And genetic perfection is something you're never going to find. It's also something that's completely subjective based on what user base you're trying to talk to. I think a good guiding principle here is that Tantalus Labs tries to grow weed that we would like to consume. We're lucky to have a lot of weed nerds on our team. I've been a student of cannabis since my teenage years. I don't mind telling you that. And this process, albeit currently in our situation, it is a bit of a treasure hunt, and maybe we can quantify it further and be able to refine that treasure hunt so that we have a bit more of an idea where the treasure is as we grow and evolve, and really smart geneticists can help us do that. But this is how we run our process. So every cultivar, every strain that we do, we started with 100 to 200 seeds. Half of those seeds are going to be male. You don't want to have male seeds in your cultivation environment, and they don't flower, so you got to get rid of the dudes. And in the remaining 50%, you're going to see a few variations from seed. Cannabis is sort of like apple seeds. If you plant an apple seed in your yard that you got from a Granny Smith apple, you're no way guaranteed that you're going to get a Granny Smith apple tree. And so you'll see big plants, small plants, stringy plants, dense plants, and just even selecting based on agricultural strength alone, you're going to be looking for a sort of specific subset of that original pheno run. And I think that's the first baseline. We're in an agricultural business. There's going to be awesome, crazy, weird genetics that are not agriculturally strong. They will come out of micro growers. The micro growers can have them. That's going to be great. I can't wait to buy some cultivar that's released, a strain drop that's just a few hundred grams or a few hundred ounces from a micro grower. But for us, we need to have agricultural productivity and yield as a baseline component, at least of this discussion. And then the other side of that is once you've established the subset of cultivars that have that robustness, now we're talking about user preference. Does this strain smell the right way? Does it have the right amount of THC in it? Does it have the right amount of CBD if that's what you're looking for? And then once we have maybe, of 200 seeds, maybe we have 10 or 15 plants, then we all sit down and we all just hash it out. Have a heated debate about what we're looking for out of this particular product, who we're trying to talk to. I think integrating brand into that discussion has been a really critical success factor for us because it's not just about the grower's intuition. You can't just trust the grower to know about the market. The last 50 years of cannabis, it's been very rare for a cannabis grower to actually touch their end user. They've had to deal with brokers, they've had to deal with distributors, and so that's why we like to bring the people that have the best frontlines insight into that discussion around phenotypic selection. Finishing, we touched on it earlier, and this is an interesting one because there's just so much voodoo, there's so much mythology around you need to cure it for 120 days and it needs to be at this temperature level, and so we're really trying to find the highest ROI opportunities for a firm of our size, which is at 75,000 square feet. We're sort of a big craft guy, I guess. That's probably the best way but we still rely on process. So we do dry for a really long time, and I think that the nature of drying for longer, it's just a physical reality. I see a lot of discussions around technology, around how you can use integrated, sanitization, irradiation with your drying process to make it happen faster. But we've bent and broken the drying process as many times as we can, and we find that to get the moisture from the core of the bud outwards through the outside of the bud without crisping those leaves and crushing down that terpene profile, it really does need to be 7 to 15 days for us, which is practical at 75,000 square feet. It's not always practical at large scale. We don't compress in storage. I've seen a lot of vacuum sealed cannabis, and it'll like squeeze the life out of your buds is the best analogy I can think. And then in our very expensive walk-in fridge, we were one of the early LPs that built a beautiful vault that is now no longer a practical security requirement, but we were smart enough to put in AC as well as humidity control. So it's like a massive humidor, and that allows us to preserve that bud's perfection that it has when it's harvested, but will rapidly, as it off-gasses terpenes, as it continues to age, that will become less exceptional. We can sustain it for a little bit longer, allowing us to get through the practically long path to market of packaging and then distribution through, in our case, liquor distribution boards. Sometimes we do sell direct to patients through the ACMPR, but there's going to be time there. It could be a couple of months from the time you harvest to the time it actually gets to market at the earliest, and so we really want to preserve that quality through that storage. And then, packaging for quality retention. This is really interesting. We've seen a diversity of different packaging. The entire sector has been forced to jump on packaging opportunities and make quick decisions to be able to actually get to market. So ironically, a lot of people talk to us about the glass jars that we launched when we did our medical program, and those were a beautiful kind of coming out party. They're also financially unsustainable over the long term. And so when we're looking at a way to complement that packaging with something that really was going to put the bud at the forefront of our brand strategy, we came up with the pouches. Those pouches happen to be some of the lowest cost packaging you can do. When you package in a glass or plastic jar, it's rattling around in transit. The pouch doesn't compress, but it also just keeps the bud in the right place. And so we really like those, and it'll be interesting to see if our users perceive that value the same way that we do. Okay, genetics optimization. This is kind of the paradigm that we put ourselves in. We're here to serve this plant's DNA. And we're trying to serve a diversity of different plants' DNA, and we're actually finding out which kinds of strains and families of strains we don't want to do in our particular greenhouse, and that there's no indoor environment that's superior than a greenhouse, but there are some genetics that have been tailored over multiple generations to work better in a lower light environment and necessitate a lot of environmental control that might be unsustainable as your greenhouse grows in scale. So it is somewhat about selecting genetics for your particular infrastructure, but once you've gotten kind of a broad range of genetics you're interested in, that infrastructure needs to serve that plant. So water purification is something we're huge on at Tantalus Labs. All of our irrigation, which goes into fertigation, fertilizer and irrigation water, comes from recaptured rainwater. This was born of necessity because we have a well on our site that was it seemed to be a little bit high in sulfur for what we wanted to do. But it turns out that because we don't use city water, the water's never treated with chlorine or fluoride. And those things can kind of irritate plants as they're growing. We run that through reverse osmosis, sand filtration, and UV filtration to get water that's like way cleaner than Fiji water. We actually have a joke. Someone's had a Fiji water and I just like slapped it out of their hand, like, don't drink that at Sunlab, just drink from the tap. We use nutrient programs that we build. I think in the greenhouse industry, you guys are fully used to this, but many cannabis growers think they need to rely on premixed nutrients. It's way better to just datify what nutrients you're giving to the plant and then iterate it over time. You might have your first couple of cycles be a bit less yield than you'd like, but you'll learn really quickly what the plant needs, and that allows you to tailor your nutrient program specific to those cultivars. Abundant light. You need a lot of light to grow cannabis. That's why greenhouse is the best way to do it. You're getting a full or high intensity of light and a full spectrum of light, and then we also supplement that light. We use high pressure sodium lamps. I think a lot of good greenhouses do. There's a lot of cool, interesting stuff going on with LEDs. We're not really ready to put our crops at risk to be at the forefront of that discussion, so we're kind of playing it a bit safe there. But sunlight, abundant sunlight, that's going to be the best thing. This region of the world is probably the best in Canada for light levels. I'm willing to go and say that for you guys. You guys win on the light levels, but we have a bit of a warmer winter. So that's the counterpoint. But yeah, that's why, really interesting to see how growers in California are adapting and other even equatorial countries. It's going to be such a cool story when we get to see these genetics that have been honed in Canada, maybe 5 or 10 years time, maybe sooner, really rip in those equatorial countries. Remediation, yeah, basically if you need to treat your crop for a problem, you're probably not going to be able to call that harvest really at the apex of cannabis quality because you let something go wrong. And an ounce of prevention is worth a ton of remediation. You've probably heard 17 people on different panels say that. But we really try to anticipate issues before they might happen, anticipate changes in environment and how that might affect the plant. And just trying to keep ahead of everything is really the trick in these greenhouses. And then at Tantalus, I think, once again, speaking to a greenhouse audience, you guys are all aware of integrated pest management and using your environment to really self-correct. But we love predatory insects. We're not allowed to use pesticides, obviously, in the ACMPR, and I think premium cannabis or high-quality cannabis would probably avoid pesticide use anyway. And so having, I think, 13 different populations in our region of the world that combat the specific issues that are inherent to that area, it's so cool. I think in late last year, we saw some thrips in our greenhouse, and we both have preventative pest populations that live, and they would eat those pests, just sort of our symbiotic little sentinels that are keeping us safe. And we saw some thrips, and we deployed remediative pests, and they were gone in like 2 hours. It was crazy to our growers who had never thought to do that. But yeah, really, really cool to see that technology driving back to a return to nature. So I guess the only contentious part of this conversation or controversial that this room probably is well adjusted to receive is that right now the best quality cannabis on earth, or at least the perception of consumer quality, still does come from indoor growers. In California, there's a lot of indoor growing brands that have done exceptionally well in terms of releasing products that attach themselves to a high price point. And sometimes there's a lot of kind of marketing, selling the sizzle going on, and sometimes there really is good cannabis quality. But I think the greenhouses have the potential to raise that quality ceiling. And the logic is pretty simple. When you run a warehouse that you've turned into a grow-op, you're essentially converting a boat into a car. It's an inherently inferior environment to grow plants because it hasn't been designed to grow plants. Greenhouses also have a great advantage in airflow. At Sunlab, I think we have two 54,000 cubic feet per minute half fans per bay, which gives us about 10 times the amount of potential airflow as you would get from any, like the most optimized warehouse environment. That airflow is really awesome for reducing your risk of pests, of encouraging the plant to grow really well, pulling transpiration off the plant's leaves. And airflow just seems to be a cornerstone of every problem we're trying to solve. Light quantity, quality, and diffusion. We talked a bit about the intensity of sunlight being supplemented with the photoperiod augmentation lamps. And light quality, it's weird, the light science isn't really there with cannabis yet to understand why the full spectrum of sunlight delivers to the plant so well. It's probably, we don't need to dissect a rose's petals to understand its beauty. It's just that sunlight is great for plants. It's been awesome for the last 4.5 billion years. Let's keep it going. 4.5 billion more years of sunlight affecting plant growth positively. And then diffusion, we do use diffusion layers at Sunlab, and it's just so cool to take photos in that environment because there's no shadows. You walk around, and everybody we bring through that's in the photography or video game is super excited by that. Industrial level sanitization, so you need to be able to take every surface in your greenhouse, every wire, every cable, every camera, every sensor, and hose it down with isopropyl alcohol, hammer it with hot steam, and it needs to all be robust in that. It just makes your sanitization processes way easier. I've seen cultivation operations that are sort of finicky to sanitize, and it drives everybody nuts. So when you build it dead strong so you can really crash around the walls a bit. And then, yeah, we spoke a bit about integrated pest management. You know, the notion at the outset of the MMPR was that you needed to build like clean room pharma style grows. They don't work very well, and they're very expensive. I think it's a cool exercise to see about growing cannabis on Mars. That's a really fun thing to do, but unfortunately, it just doesn't make for competitive economic enterprises. So, yeah, you know, we get to talk a bit of, there's always language in every industry. We get to talk a lot of jargon in the ACMPR as we do. But I think, you know, to close this presentation off, we really just need to boil this down to first principles. It's really simple logic. Plants need light, water, and nutrients in sometimes intricate combinations. And the water that you can get from a greenhouse or an indoor environment, no real difference. You could have the purest water you want, put it in an indoor environment. The nutrients, they're the same compounds, the same molecules, but the light is a substantial advantage in a greenhouse. You simply cannot replicate the power of the sun. These lights that are hitting me right now in the face, they're very bright, but they are nowhere near the brightness of the sun. And so we've got this 6, 7 billion year old fusion reactor that hangs in the sky. It's done a really exceptional job of fueling plant growth, and I think it will continue to do that for as long as plants exist on this planet. So that's why I believe that the future of excellent quality cannabis will continue to increase and grow, and why it's going to happen in a greenhouse.
Thanks, Dan. I think we do have time for questions. You kept your presentation right down to the right amount of time, so that was perfect.
That was completely by accident.
2 microphones on either side. If anybody in the audience has any questions for Dan, which I'm sure you do. Craig has some. Go for it, Craig.
This comes from last night, Lel, one of our...
Twitter fingers.
No, one of our community members.
All right.
How did you go about choosing the 5 strains currently available at Tantalus, and what do you have in store for the future in terms of product diversity and offerings?
So great. I can tell this room.
You might want to repeat it.
Okay. How do we choose our first 5 strains in the Tantalus range, is what we call our product line, and what do we have in store for the future? Thanks for the softball. What was his name? Her name? Last Night Lel. Last Night Lel knows what makes me tick. So I was inspired by a mentor of mine, Ryan Lee, to talk about cannabis as moving away from a categorization platform of indica and sativa. It doesn't mean a ton. It's kind of a kooky sentiment that someone came up with, and it's just not a great classification system if you want to give users a predictable way to categorize their experiences. So he taught me to look at it as CBD dominant cultivars, ideally that have low to no THC, balanced cultivars that have a little bit of both, and then high THC cultivars. And those three categories are going to give you at least a semblance of predictability. I know terpenes affect everything, and I know that that's an oversimplification, but we do need to find a way to tell these stories to new cannabis users. So we kind of looked for hitters in all those categories and stuff that wasn't going to be too unapproachable from a baseline audience of what we then analyzed as a demographic of people that were buying ACMPR cannabis. So I will say, if you're like a hyper cannabis genetics nerd, you're not going to look at the Tantalus range and see like, whoa, this is amazing, categoric, bleeding edge genetics. We have some awesome products in the high CBD category that have been doing fantastically well in our medical platform. I think because it's not just the CBD that's the story. They also have these beautiful flavor profiles, and the botany is really exciting. We have one cultivar called Skunk Haze, which is a storied historic favorite in British Columbia in that balanced category. It's actually my favorite strain of cannabis right now. I would smoke more cannabis if I could, but I've got a lot of stuff to do, and sometimes cannabis can get in the way of that. So for a casual user, for a new user, for somebody who's not looking for the most psychoactive experience, it's a really great balance between 1 part THC and 2 parts CBD. And then a variety of products in that high THC category. And I think all of them are like, Blue Dream or Harlequin. These are brands that if you've had some interaction with cannabis, you'd probably know. But we know that they're kind of great starter offerings. Next summer, we're going to come out with some stuff, a few things that just have an exceptional flavor profile, and that's really the story we're going to be telling aside from potency. And then a few things that are coming from a bit of a heritage collection. Some seeds that haven't been popped in a long time, some seeds that maybe, if you were a cannabis nerd on the West Coast in the 90s or in the 80s, you might have tried and you haven't been able to access since. I think that's going to be really exciting to bring some people back to cannabis experiences that they might have had when they were younger. And then we actually play this out over a 3 or 4 year time horizon. It's going to be 2021 before we really come with the heat, with some stuff that is going to blow people's minds and take that quality ceiling and push it up.
Okay, I can't really see if there's anybody is there on that side? Okay, because those bright lights are like right in my eyes. Go ahead.
You got to get used to it.
I know. The indoor grow industry has done a very good job of controlling one thing, and that's odor production coming out of their facilities. However, greenhouse operations are inherently not capable of doing that because of the way they're currently designed, and this area has a very tenuous balance between its greenhouse industry and its residential neighbors, whether it's 1 or 100. How is that going to be addressed? I have some very, very angry, upset, skeptical residents in our community that they're going to be able to do that and not impact their quality of life.
I have to answer these questions in Maple Ridge. I got to come to Leamington and then answer these questions. Freya should be answering these questions. So first of all, you are dead wrong that greenhouses cannot control odor inherently because of their design. By the nature...
I know that, but they don't know that.
Let me answer the question, sir. I got it for you. So roof-vented greenhouses do have issues with odor inherently. That's going to be a problem, and that's from a greenhouse conversion principle. If you're not changing your airflow into a negative pressure environment that goes through an intake and out through an exhaust, yes, that is going to be an odor. There's going to be odor issues associated with those greenhouses. We're dealing with it in Vancouver, in the Metro Vancouver area. We're dealing with it here, and I think the real answer for greenhouse conversions is that you do have to consider where you're putting them, where they exist. If they exist in places that have residences close by, you better have I was going to swear, but a really good community engagement program that goes out and talks to those residents and figures out what their core principles are and what, if there's anything to be done to appease them, then that, or you need to choose greenhouse locations that are in areas that are geographically isolated. But in a greenhouse conversion or new build, where you can build a negative pressure environment, which really is ideal for ACMPR cannabis anyway. Roof vents have a host of different problems. They basically just don't vent effectively enough to really consistently prevent crop loss. We, Tantalus Labs, for the first time in history, built a passive odor filter, non-mechanized odor filter that we actually borrowed the concept from the hog farming industry. It's non-mechanized. It's just a substrate of essentially wood chips that we then cultivate a bioactive bacteria on our exhaust bays. That bacteria thrives on cannabis terpenes. So as we push air through that filter and out through the exhaust of our greenhouse, though that biofilter absorbs that smell, and you can walk around the perimeter of our building envelope, and you cannot smell cannabis when like the stinkiest strains we have are in full flower. At the perimeter of our property, it's absolutely undetectable. So this is a question of industrial design and planning. And I agree with you. If I lived in a place and someone put up a cannabis greenhouse right beside me and all of a sudden my house smelled like cannabis all the time, I'd be pissed off. And so this is a community engagement thing, but it's not inherently impossible.
Okay. I think we've got a question over here.
Yeah, just going back to your final summation where you're like nutrients and water, no difference, and then light difference. I just wonder if you could speak a little to like terroir and if you see that as kind of a factor in kind of ongoing cannabis growth.
Right. So I'm not a sommelier and I'm not a wine expert, first caveat and qualifier. But what I understand of terroir is a combination of soil characteristics, environmental conditions, and regional specificity that brings character out in a wine grape. It's also a little bit, it's not voodoo, but it's something extra. There's something, the Bordeaux region is masked in mythology. It's masked in this beautiful storytelling that makes it even more appealing than just what the inherent natural environment is. So to use terroir in the context of cannabis, I think can be a little bit risky until we're dealing with regions that are fully outdoor grown and outdoor grown in soil using natural and organic principles. That's when terroir really makes a lot of sense. When we talk about, say, BC Bud, which has a really storied history and like it's equal parts brand opportunity for me and like mills thrown around my neck, because if I don't come correct, 70 people are going to be like, BC Bud, you're not BC Bud, your strains suck or something like that. So we do think about it really deeply. And that's maybe a combination of region and genetics. There's genetics that are specific to British Columbia or were bred in British Columbia, and those are really exciting to a user. So I think if we want to go full Burgundy region on cannabis, we've got to wait a little while until we see outdoor growers that are thriving, and there are very, very few geographic regions in Canada where outdoor cannabis would thrive and be able to flower late into October without being compromised by environmental conditions. So I'm not going to use the word terroir, but I still think greenhouses are a better way to talk about the environmental specificity of a region, because you're not replicating nature. You're nudging it in the right direction. And that's why I think greenhouses are a far more natural principle, even if you want to buy natural cannabis, let alone the fact that they're just inherently agriculturally designed systems.
Thank you.
Okay. I think that's all we have time for.
Great.
So thank you for stepping in earlier. Oh, can we do
Come on, let's do it.
Thank you for stepping in earlier, and thanks for your talk right now.